Afternoon, good evening, everyone. We might have a bit of a slow morning here in Washington because it's a Monday morning and it's just about as dreary and drab and rainy a day as you could possibly get. So hopefully people will join us as we go along. But I want to thank everyone for joining us for this session, which is really an opportunity for us to share the sort of the data and insights that we have gleaned from the State of Access to Modern Energy Cooking Services report. At SMAP, we recognize that cooking, although an essential daily activity, is remarkably the most neglected aspect of SDG 7, and one where progress has not only been slow, but in fact has been going in the wrong direction, and possibly set back further with the COVID pandemic. And what's more disturbing is that a continued lack of access to modern cooking solutions, well, it not only jeopardizes SDG 7, but also probably progress towards several related SDGs. So this is a problem that has broad and deep implications. In September, we launched the State of Access to Modern Energy Cooking Services report in partnership with our colleagues at Loughborough University in the MECS program, supported by FCDO, also with the Clean Cooking Alliance. And that report took stock of the progress in the sector and outlines a way forward to achieve universal access. The numbers are somewhat ominous. 2.8 billion people still cook with traditional polluting fuels and technologies, and the cost is a staggering $4 trillion each year, driven by the adverse impacts on health, climate, and gender equality. So this report builds on the World Bank's multi-tier framework for measuring energy access, and therefore provides a comprehensive understanding of household cooking energy needs to inform strategies for the adoption of modern energy cooking solutions. Solutions to tackle this pressing development challenge must prioritize user preferences and local cooking context to address long-standing barriers to the adoption of modern cooking solutions. Now, we all know there are new technologies, there are new business models, financing mechanisms that enable affordable solutions. We are going to have to scale these up with public and private funding, from the current rather meager tens of millions of dollars to the billions, along with the adoption of policies and regulations to make that happen. There is, I think, clearly a growing consensus at the national level, at a global level, across development partners on the importance of the cooking sector. And there is, I see an increasing policy prioritization at a global and country level. In fact, today we've launched the RISE 2020 report, which is a sort of a scorecard of how countries are doing on policies and regulations for achieving SDG 7. And what's interesting to see is that, in fact, there has been clear improvement in the policies adopted by countries on clean cooking. It's concentrated in a few countries, but those countries represent a very large share of those without access. And clearly, we need to, we need to now take this forward. I think what is particularly of importance to us is that we must try to formalize cooking energy demand in national energy planning and development of strategy, so that cooking is part of energy, sector planning, not something that is sort of off to the side. And so that is why I think the work we've done on the MECS report with the rich data sets and insights from the report would be so helpful, I think, to everyone in the international community to really design our strategies, our scale-up programs based on good data and sort of the rich set of experiences we've been able to collect through this exercise. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Yabe, and I want to thank everybody for joining. And we look forward to a really interesting conversation today. And of course, what we really look forward to is all of you being able to use the data and information and really have the basis for the analytics you need to move forward. Because a lot of what people say is, are there solutions? What works? What doesn't? There's a lot of sort of rigid mindset around clean cooking that is gradually going away, and we need to accelerate that. And I really hope that this report will do that. So again, I want to thank very much our partners, Ed Brown in particular, Dimfna at the Clean Cooking Alliance and her colleagues, and we are very thankful for this cooperation. Abe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rohit, for the good introduction, the background. Again, I welcome everyone to this session on deep dive of MECS data. So as Rohit mentioned, we launched this MECS report back in September. And we really want to use the state modern energy cooking services, this report, as a base to build the knowledge and collect more data and inform policymakers and various stakeholders in promoting clean cooking solutions. So the State of MECS report is building on the earlier research, such as MTF, multi-tier framework, particularly on the demand side analysis, and then develop a new framework, how we define improved cooking solutions and modern energy cooking solutions. And then that developed a pathway in terms of what's the current cost of inaction and how we reach to the universal access for different scenarios. So this session is really, we bring the core team of this report and to talk about, okay, how those data were collected, were modeled, what assumptions behind it, what are tools being developed, and really want to have a discussion, okay, how to use it and whether it's useful and how we can continue to build this knowledge base. By the way, as you may know that this MECS program is now fully integrated under the Clean Cooking Fund knowledge pillar. So under Clean Cooking Fund, we have two main pillars. One is investment pillars, really to leverage private sector, private and public investment. The second pillar is the knowledge, policy, coordination, and innovation. And this MECS program is fully supporting this pillar. And want to use this opportunity to connect more of the researchers and stakeholders and can discuss how we collectively build more knowledge and share what we've learned and to help to inform pathway moving forward. So for the session, we have quite a full panel speakers and also panel of discussants. If you have questions, please feel free to put your question on the chat box. And at the end of the presentations, we'll also have opportunity to conduct a poll. So to get more of your feedback on how we can improve our the sessions, knowledge exchange events. So with that, let's start. I want to first introduce my colleague, Alicia Pinto, energy specialist, working on the Clean Cooking Fund, to present the insights from multi-tier framework. So Alicia, over to you.
Thank you, Abe. I'm gonna quickly share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the demand side and some of the key insights and results we've got on the demand side in this report. A quick overview of what we'll talk about in the next 7 minutes. I'll first introduce what we mean by access to modern energy cooking services, and then present the key results from our definition and the data that we've got through the multi-tier framework. And then we dig deeper into some of the insights on the global fuel mix, how fuel and stove stacking, what the trends are in across the globe, and then a few insights on affordability and convenience of solutions for households. So to start off, the multi-tier framework is a tool to measure access. So it uses performance-based technical attributes, and it combines it with attributes that are important to a household's cooking context. So the performance-based attributes that a lot of you are aware of are emissions and efficiency of the stove and fuel combination. And then along with that, we look at how affordable a cooking solution is. Is it safe for a household to use? Is it available when the household wants to use the fuel and the stove? And is it convenient? So is it convenient in terms of time that the household takes to collect the fuel, to prepare the stove, and to cook? And when we combine these 6 attributes, we have the 6 attributes of the multi-tier framework, where we look at exposure, which is an interpretation of emissions, looking at the stove and fuel combination, as well as the stacking of stove and fuels within the household. And then efficiency, the thermal efficiency of the stove and fuel, how affordable it is, the safety, availability, and convenience. And so when we put these 6 attributes together, we score each household from 0 to 5 on each of these attributes. And they get a final score, which is a household aggregate score, which is equivalent to the lowest tier among all the 6 attributes. So for example, if a household is at, say, tier 4 for all the attributes except for convenience, and it's at tier 2, then the final household attribute, final household score will be tier 2. So when we're defining modern energy cooking services, we refer to a household context that meets the standards of tier 4 or higher on all 6 attributes of the multi-tier framework. And that's our definition for MECS. On the other hand, when we refer to a household context that meets at least tier 2 on all 6 attributes, but not tier 4, we refer to this context as an improved cooking services situation. And these households are known to be in transition. So now that I've quickly walked you through what the MTF is, I want to show you our results from our analysis. So in the report, we based our data on the MTF surveys, national household level surveys, and we created archetypes based on the MECS results, and we applied it to 71 countries across the globe. And what you see on your screen is a snapshot of our estimates. So we find that 4 billion people lack access to MECS across the world. And of these 4 billion, we have 1.25 billion people who are in transition. So they have access to improved cooking services. And then there's the rest of the 2.7 billion who are not as well off, and they are in the lower tiers. What we found is geographically, sub-Saharan Africa is not doing very well. So only 10% of their population has access to MECS. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have Latin America, countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as in East Asia that have higher access to MECS. So walking through what this means in terms of the fuel that households are using and the primary fuel, what we see is that households over time, over the last 10 years, households have increasing access to clean fuels. But we've also seen that the share in absolute terms of households with less clean fuels has also grown. So some of these results are reflective of there's a population growth in areas where households that primarily rely on wood have increased. Even though overall you have households increasingly using clean fuel like LPG or electricity. And this trend is also reflected in not only the primary fuel, but you see when we're looking at the multiple fuels that households are using. So when we looked into the data, we found that stacking, that's using more than one fuel, is very common. It's prevalent in urban areas more than rural areas, but also prevalent in higher income households. So you see stacking across the income quintiles in your map on the screen over here. And in urban areas, you have a higher incidence of stacking. And that's usually because households in urban areas tend to use less reliant on wood and tend to use multiple fuels. And stacking is very important also when we look at availability of the fuels that households use. And when we talk about stacking, what we found was that there are two different phenomena when it comes to stacking. We talk about clean stacking, which is where households traditionally are using a primary fuel, which is a primary fuel and stove combination, which is not as efficient, but their secondary fuel is clean. And on the other hand, we have dirty stacking, which is when a household has their primary stove and fuel combination, which is clean, as we can see here in Nepal and Myanmar, but their secondary stove and fuel combination is inefficient. So they're using probably 3 stone fires or they're using traditional stoves. And so what we need to do, and these are some recommendations from a paper by our colleagues, is we need to change the narrative of stacking. So stacking needs to be a part of any promotional activities or efforts, and it needs to be included in how we design our programs. We also need to standardize the number of burners that we include in our programs to a minimum of 2 burners, because we know that households not only use one stove, and if stacking is evident, they need multiple burners to meet their household needs. And then on the research side, we need to be able to better capture data on secondary stove usage. So moving on to another very important aspect, which we found in our report, is that income is a fundamental driver of fuel and stove demand. And this is seen especially in the types of fuel that households are using. Lower income households are very reliant on wood and charcoal, which are more affordable fuels. And then when you have cleaner fuels, there are higher barriers to access and there are higher upfront costs for households. And so it's more difficult, and we need to start thinking about how do we close this affordability gap. And it's a very important factor. And so similarly, what we find is that even when you're looking at affordability across rural and urban areas, you see a stark difference where households are, where low-income households bear a higher brunt of the income gap in affordability. So they face higher barriers to access cleaner fuels. It's more expensive for the households, and even to switch over to different stoves or fuels would need some kind of intervention and support. But it's not. There are positive trends, and this is part of our report where we've seen clean fuels are becoming increasingly cost competitive. So you have biofuels, LPG, that can close a gap, especially in urban areas, between fuels such as charcoal and kerosene that are becoming more expensive for households. We also have evidence of electricity becoming more efficient or cheaper, especially with efficient cooking appliances. And so these are some positive trends which make us more optimistic about the sector as we move forward. And the last part is I want to talk about the convenience and the time that households spend cooking. So convenience factors are really important because what we've done is we're measuring the time that households take to collect a fuel, as well as the time that households take to cook with the fuel. And though we see very stark variation across fuels, these trends are consistent across countries. So we have more inefficient or biomass fuels that take a lot more time to cook with, but cleaner fuels take a lot less time of a lot less of the household's time to cook. And this is important as we start thinking about how it relates to gender equality, but also when firms are looking into integrating convenience factors into how their business model, what they've approached as business models. And we've seen some examples such as the Cocoa Network, which takes into account, or they use technology that takes into account cooking time and convenience when they're planning their own business models. And so just to wrap up on the demand side, what we'd like to see is that any effort to accelerate access to modern energy cooking services needs to have users at the center. That's really important as we go forward to thinking about how we can ensure demand, because that requires services, products, and interventions that are adapted to what the household needs. And then to overcome barriers of high upfront costs, especially capital costs, we need to also we need to work on lowering we need to increase the information and the public awareness of households, and we need to also overcome the barrier of low availability of solutions. And then when stacking persists, especially what I explained as dirty stacking, we need to have new messaging around products and aspirations, as well as have options available for households. So I'll stop here and over to you, Yabe.
Thank you, Alicia. So you can see that the MTF has really been the foundation of the MECS MECS program work. The MTF was launched back in 2015, so already 5 years of work, and quite a few countries already collect data. In fact, the MTF data collected has been used as architect countries to inform the modeling of the global MECS, the state of the access to MECS. I just want to highlight a couple 2 points that Alicia mentioned. One is stacking. So if you're on our description list, you've seen the recent article about the insight on stacking. I want to highlight that the stacking is already being incorporated in our project design. So we will allow RBF to provide and actually encourage RBF participants to offer two-burner solutions. And the cost also being modeled in the next presentation that when the double team mentioned about the investment needs. And second key highlight is this affordability as a main barrier. In order to address affordability, one is to have a more cost effective solutions. So encourage more investments, economy of scale, to have lower cost solutions, but also recognize public subsidies is important if we want to reach universal access to modern energy cooking services. That's why in the cost investment needs modeling, again, Dalbrook team will mention how that was incorporated in the modeling process. And again, that is also reflected in our project design. Because if you think about RBF, results-based financing, public incentives, it's in some programs, it's directly fill in the affordability gap. And awareness raising is also a key part to help to raise the consumers' willingness to pay. Okay, so with that, I want to turn over to the Dalbrook team, who led by Mark Paya, the senior project manager, Oren Hubin, partner, and Michael San, partner of Dalbrook. So, Marcus, over to you.
Thank you, Yabe, and thank you, Alicia, for that introduction, as well as Rohit. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today, many of whom have contributed as well through the consultations that we did through this report this year and last. It was a great exercise and a great lift. That was a clear co-creation between ASMAP, the MECS and Loughborough teams, and the Clean Cooking Alliance over the course of the last year and a half. And we want to essentially focus today our conversation on key data elements that are included within the State of Access report. And so before we actually jump in, I think it's worth highlighting that the State of Access report introduces a range of different quantifications that try to give this picture of access, this picture of the state of the sector. And first and foremost, this, as Alicia walked through, there's a good amount of demand side data, demand side access modeling that points to this updated picture of access and uses this language of modern energy cooking services, evolving from previous understandings of that were more binary between clean and non-clean, expanding the horizon of what it means to have access to modern energy cooking services, and emphasizes the term services because it goes beyond just the technology. It's about the environment. It's about the market as well, in which households access both stoves and fuels to be able to cook effectively. And so there's a strong picture here on the demand side and updating that. On the supply side, the report also includes a range of I think interesting quantifications. A data analysis of the Clean Cooking Alliance partner database, give an updated picture of where we are in the world, where we are spread out in the world. And we ran also an enterprise survey that looks at key trends, key demands, key financing needs of suppliers. So whether it's manufacturers, whether it's distributors, and very much cut across different kinds of technologies and fuel types. As Rohit mentioned early in the call, there's also a cost of inaction analysis, so a segmentation of climate, gender, and health costs that look at what would happen if we don't act, and what happens if, to some extent, the status quo continues. And then finally, a set of analyses which we call sort of the cost of transition or the transition pathway, and this is where we want to focus today. And this is essentially looking forward to 2030, looking forward to this idea of universal access. What would it cost? What would it take in order to get there? And before I double click, important to highlight there are two distinct scenarios within this report, and I think it's useful to highlight that. One is, fundamentally, what would it take to get the global population in 2030 to tier 4 or higher of access? And then what would it take to get the global population to a tier 2 or 3, so to a transition scenario? And so what we want to do today is walk through a little bit the methodology and some of the key assumptions that go into assessing this cost of transition. It's a 4-step process, and I want to walk us through sort of these 4 steps. I think at a high level, though, it's a pretty relatively straightforward volume by value calculation, and that we first start out with this point 1, which is a calculation and estimation and segmentation of the addressable population in 2030. So what is that population in 2030 that, as of the variables that we have in control right now will not have access to modern energy cooking services by then. What is that population we should work to serve? And so one important thing in this step of the process is understanding to some extent our data limitations, right? Not every country in the world or within our database of lower income, lower middle income countries, and even middle income countries, not all of those have MTF survey data that adequately allows you to segment by tiers, right? So what this step of the process does is look at forecasts and a natural evolution of forecasts of urban and rural populations in 2030 and segments them by potential primary cooking populations. So we use what we call sort of MECS access ratios, in which we apply archetypes of certain countries. In this case, we use 6 different countries for which we had robust MTF data, and applied those to populations in comparator countries or comparable countries. And that allowed us to say, okay, in 2030, what is the share of the population in Burkina Faso that will be around tier 1, and that will be cooking primarily with wood or other biomass. And through this model, and of course updating it over time, you're able to see what would it take to take that specific population at the urban and rural split to tier 4. The second and third steps in this process work with each other. So the second one is really about thinking about what is each country's path forward. What is that market trajectory or scenario in which they will get to transition? And so this is thinking about, will Burkina Faso in this case, will they move forward with an electric cooking transition, an LPG cooking transition, a biogas, ethanol, or a mixed fuel cooking transition? And so we used, in this case, forecasts that existed where possible for countries to understand what pathway each country was going on, and also undertook a good amount of desk research to simulate and get to a best possible comparator to what pathway each country would embark on. And this is, I think, a very important input, as you'll see through these 4 steps. This is an important input that we believe can be further updated and further enhanced over time as countries roll out more clear and more definitive energy transition plans for cooking, for power, but more broadly for your energy access to 2030. The third element of this methodology took what we call transition costs for each of these different kinds of transitions. So we looked at a variety of factors that would be required to transition per household from below tier 4 to tier 4. And this looked at, for each of these different scenarios, electric, LPG, biogas, ethanol, and also improved cooking. It also put forward essentially what would be the essential costs of infrastructure, particularly midstream and downstream, not necessarily upstream, fuel, as well as stove, and socialization. So any kind of behavior change program that would be embedded into this process. And so per household, we developed a unit cost of transition. And step 4 essentially multiplied each addressable segment in 2030 by a weighted transition cost that reflected each country's energy trajectory. So if, for example, in step 1, we identified the Burkina Faso rural wood consumers that were at stage 1, we essentially projected what would it cost to take them over the course of 10 years of this transition on the path that their country was based on, which is step 2, and at the cost that transition was modeled at. So whether if they're embarking on a biogas cooking, what would the cost of that biogas be? And that gave us essentially a set of future costs. So again, a mix of archetype applications, of forecasting and simulations based on population growth and urbanization, and also a good range of different assumptions related to the cost of transition. I think one important thing to highlight here within the proxy transition costs, as Yabe mentioned, is that this is based on a 2-stove scenario. and on the cost of fuel to supply that, as well as on different kinds of caloric inputs and differences between urban and rural segments in terms of energy consumption. And so a range of the different data sources that we used to put this forward, on the addressable population for 2030, a very diverse range of data sources. MTF survey data, particularly for the six countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia that we had available. A range of development indicators, population data. And then also to build the rough, essentially fuel population, the primary fuel mix calculation that we had for both 2020 and 2030, we relied on input around primary fuel that came from demographic and health surveys, from multiple indicator cluster surveys from UNICEF, as well as energy census data from countries where those prior to data surveys were not available. On the least cost best fit energy market trajectory scenario, we looked at a range of IEA energy outlooks, as well as national energy strategies plans that were laid forward by ministries of energy, of infrastructure, or at the presidency, and where those were not available, we did also a range of interviews and secondary desk research to assume sort of a best possible energy market trajectory. And then on transition costs, this is where we used a range of different benchmarks. We used benchmarks that came from the RBF model that World Bank and Dahlberg developed a few years ago, updated those also with current market prices, particularly for fuel, which we know fluctuates a good amount. Academic studies and publication, and then a range of expert interviews and desk research, particularly for fuel categories that weren't included in the previous edition. And then finally, this multiplication took all of these different data sources. And so a couple of quick insights that came out of this calculation, and this is all developed in, I think, more detail within the report. If you look at this access to modern energy cooking services scenario, which is what we would call the ambitious one, in which we get everybody up to tier 4 or higher, this comes out to an estimate of 150 billion per year for 10 years, right? So it's a high number, a much higher number than what is being spent to this extent in the sector, and one that is primarily made up of fuel, right? So you see fuel costs that make up a significant share of transition. This scenario also, like our other scenario on improved cooking, also looks at the split of who would contribute. Right? So between public, which is your government, your donors, your development partners, the private sector that would be taking on costs themselves, and then of course the household. And so we see the household taking up a big share of these costs overall, particularly on the fuel side. And so there's strong variety here across the board, and strong variety also by region, and we'll go into that in a second. But just to highlight that the number is high for this MECS scenario because it includes so much. If you look at, for example, the improved cooking scenario, there aren't assumptions necessarily about fuel. There aren't necessarily assumptions about downstream infrastructure. It's primarily focused on what would it take to get every household that isn't yet cooking with a stove that meets an improved standard, right? So the cost there is much more reduced because you remove other data categories. At the global level, and this is sort of an evolution of a graphic that Alicia shared earlier, this is the picture in 2030. This is a picture of the costs. The size of the bubble here is really about the number of households, and then the splits within are really the cost figures. And what you see is a strong variety. This is driven primarily in terms of contribution and in terms of the size by a range of factors. The primary being urban and rural splits and the different costs that are required for urban and rural splits to get there, as well as different notions of affordability. So the model also bakes in assumptions that are related to affordability rates in lower income versus in lower middle income, and several evolutions in there. And so that shifts also some of that affordability burden, maybe a little bit more away from households in your lowest income countries and more towards governments and development partners in order to get there. I'm going to pass over to Oren to take us through also some broader reflections of what this exercise yielded for us.
Great. Thank you, Marcos, and thanks again, everybody, for this conversation, and for the World Bank and the partners for organizing it. Maybe just to close out our section here, just thinking about some reflections and ways that we can imagine improving upon this type of analysis going forward. And as Marcus made clear, and as Alicia pointed out earlier, this is really a data-driven exercise, and with any modeling exercise, the results are really only as good as the quality of the data that went into it. And in this case, we benefited from quite detailed data sets from MTF, supplemented by a number of other sources. And we're excited that that set of data are going to only improve going forward as the World Bank continues to build on those data sets. But there might be two areas broadly for improvement going forward. As we know, data is an important application or part of the clean energy transition process across many different institutions. And so we're heartened to see such an emphasis on data within these institutions. We see that there's, within the improving data collection category, certainly undertaking additional segmentation analysis with the MTF data is an area that we see can be taken forward quite concretely, improving the understanding of users, as Alicia pointed out earlier, getting a sense for what drives stacking behavior, what drives the choice making among households. Certainly that varies across geographies and contexts, and so the more information we have to really understand the users at that level, that can really help us with the modeling itself to get a sense for where investments might be needed. And alongside that, we believe there's a role for additional qualitative insights around driven by behavioral and human-centered design approaches that can really help to really round out and provide a more comprehensive picture of users and their needs and how they make decisions. And then secondly, improving data application and thinking about where to use the insights from these reports in specific program design. We understand a number of partners are looking actively at results-based financing initiatives, and as Yabe mentioned, there's a way to embed some of these ideas and insights related to stacking in particular in those programs. And then finally, thinking about policy making, ways to design better, more accurate policies across the energy access spectrum, whether that's, as was mentioned earlier, integrating cooking energy in national energy planning processes, or thinking about improvements in standards and regulations for different stoves and fuels as ways to improve access and demand. So these are just a few suggestions that we wanted to leave with as a way to continue, evolve, and improve this type of analysis that we're all interested in continuing going forward. And with that, I will turn it back over to Yabe.
Thank you, Oren. I see there are already some questions, and so quickly on this one, that building, it's a start of having a framework how to estimate investment needs. And our team is working on developing a clean cooking planning tool with the aim to building on the electrification spatial planning tool, like GEP. So that's working in progress, and we'll reach out to our partners. So Jan, thank you very much for the question, and we'll reach our team will reach out to you to share about some initial thoughts about this planning tool. The aim is to start building on such a tool, utilizing the overall framework and data collected through the MECS report, and then hopefully continue to improve the data collection and refining process. So as I mentioned, though, our MECS report also developed a few tools, and I will invite my colleagues to go through quickly. So considering we're already behind the schedule, so Jingyi, I'll turn to you to quickly show the mapping initiative and players. Since we have the link, so just give a sense of what is included. Over to you, Jingyi.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jingyi, and I'm an energy consultant with the ASMAP Clean Computing Fund. So I will be presenting the Access to MECS Players and Initiatives database today. So the Access to MECS Players Initiative database is part of the knowledge products under our 2020 State of Access to MECS report. So the purpose of developing this qualitative database is to better understand the supply-side ecosystem of the cooking sector. So this database takes stock of cooking players across the globe, as well as cooking initiatives taking place at the national, regional, and global level. So we're now at the homepage. There are 3 tabs: players, initiatives, and the map. And when you scroll down, you can see a brief introduction paragraph about this database. So we can start with the players page. So the database of players contains over 2,000 different organizations active in the modern energy cooking sector. So these players are categorized by geography of operation and organization type. It builds from the Clean Cooking Alliance partner directory, which includes self-reported information by industry players. So since we have relatively limited information about each player, so we do not have a very detailed page for each player. So this page is very simple and self-explanatory with all the information on the first page as you browse through it. So now we can test it with an example. So for example, on the filter section, we like to see a cooking player based in Sub-Saharan Africa, an enterprise with features of design and distribute, and headquarters in Kenya. And then when we apply the filters, you can see 14 players meeting these filter requirements. You can also play around with different filters as you wish. And then we can move on to the initiatives page. So this database of initiatives maps out past and ongoing projects and programs. Let's see. Sorry, it's like kind of freezing right now. Okay. So this database of initiatives maps out past and ongoing projects and programs in the modern energy cooking sector. So this database is categorized by global, regional, and national cooking initiatives. So currently we have 88 initiatives, and obviously does not represent an exhaustive list of programs, but seeks to provide a broad sample of stoves and fuel initiatives spanning different geographies and technologies. So we do have detailed information page for each initiative. We can take Bangladesh Clean Cooking Program as an example. So when we click in the detail page, we'll see the background information about the specific initiative. And next, we can move on to the map function. So for the map, we have 2 options. We have initiatives and players. We can just hover around the map, and you can see overall how many players. You can see how many players or initiatives in a specific country. You might need to zoom in to see about the specific initiatives or players in this country, because these initiatives are kind of like overlapping. Then you want to learn, if you want to learn more about the specific initiatives or players in the specific country, you can just click on the icon and it will take you to this page. So lastly, if you want to download the original data set, you could just click on the download button, and this will take you to our energydata.info page. And then you can choose to preview the data set or just to download the whole data set. So yeah, this database app is now active, and we have included a link in our report publications page. You can also find it on our energydata.info platform. As mentioned, this database does not represent an exhaustive list of programs or players. So if you would like your organization or initiatives to be featured on this platform, or if you have any questions about this database, just feel free to reach out to our team, and we're happy to include your organization or initiatives to our database. So thank you so much. Over to you, Yabe.
Thank you, Jingyi. So just a brief summary why we have developed this database and how it's being used by the World Bank team. As many of you that know, when we start a program in a particular country, we need to understand what already happened, who are there from the demand side to the supply side to the institution or the arrangement, and learning from the past experiences. The reason to have that database is our team actually to go to look at those data, and those data will be used as the initial next review-based assessment. So as for any database, the value will be optimized as more people using it and improve it and update it. So if you want your program to be included, your technology or your company to be included, please do reach us to us. We'll be more than happy to include in this database. Next, I want to introduce my colleague, Caroline Orting, to briefly talk about another tool we have developed for this report. Also, there is a standalone knowledge piece called Systematic Review on the drivers for modern energy cooking services. There will be separate webinar when we launch report in 2021. For next few minutes, Caroline will give a brief view and talking about the two already launched. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you, Yabe. So I'll quickly introduce this systematic map that we did. Let me share my screen. Are you able to see it? My slide? No?
No slide. It's just a black screen.
Okay.
Okay, now. Yes.
You see it now? Is it visible now?
No, it's black.
Okay, 1 minute. It's visible now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So yes, I have, I think, 5 minutes, so I'll try to be brief as possible. But so from the introduction, as it was stated, there are different sources of evidence and sources of data that led to the development of the State of Access report to modern cooking energy services. And one of the sources of evidence was this systematic review work that we did, so generating secondary data on what factors drive transition to modern cooking energy. And we used the systematic review methodology, and the key strength of it is that it helps to eliminate bias. Because say you want to know how can we transition 2.2 billion people to clean cooking, you'd probably pick the next publication or the one that came out yesterday or by somebody famous. But the idea of systematic review is you use some objective way to do this assessment, and then synthesizing all those findings, then there's more credibility and less bias in the findings. But we'll discuss this more when we launch the report early next year. So also just to explain what the map is. So we have systematic review and systematic map. So I'll present the map shortly. And it's the difference is with the map, we look at the broader set of evidence base and then try to show how much evidence is out there. While with systematic review, we try to go in depth. in-depth, even if it's 4 or 5 papers only that focuses on a question. And then the key steps we followed and that are standard is starting with the review question and its key elements. At least this one, I think it would be important that I describe so that as you look at the map and know some studies and you're not seeing them, then you can know why it's not included. And then there was protocol development, which was done by stakeholders to be sure that the question we are addressing is responding to the policy needs. And then the search, data extraction, and synthesis. So as an output of the synthesis, there's the map that I will shortly present, but then there's also the narrative synthesis that is in the report that will be launched in February. And meta-analysis can happen as well if you have very good papers with quantitative results. So to speak briefly of this PICO framework, which is population intervention, counterfactual and outcome. So the review question we set as what factors are critical to achieve large-scale transition towards sustainable energy, with particular reference for cooking in low and middle income countries. So by framing the question this way, then it's not important that the study must have been done in a low income country. So it could have been done in another setting, but the information you get is relevant for the developing country setting. So we felt that's what has been missed a lot by previous studies as well, focusing only on what's done in those settings. And then for population, we selected participants in a large-scale technology or fuel change program. So again, here scale was important because the research is supposed to inform, we are talking large-scale transition now of clean cooking. So then the scale of the study had to matter. And then the intervention, so we restricted again to large-scale programs, aiming at producing a technology change. So if we had, for instance, a randomized control trial where people are given cook stoves and followed up and measured to see what happens with the stove after a year, we excluded all those because that doesn't offer us the natural search would work better for efficacy or other kind of studies. And then counterfactual. So was there a control group evaluated where there was no intervention to be then able to attribute whatever change is observed to the actual intervention itself, or it could be something else. This would have been nice to have. So where the studies reported it, we included, but where it wasn't reported, we also still included, knowing that not so many studies include this. And then finally, the outcome. So we had the 3 measures that was extracted, whether the study reports were the impact of the intervention, positive, negative, or neutral. And then the uptake. So how many people you were using the stove and for how long. And then finally, the drivers and the barriers of change. So was it gender? Was it education? What factor was a barrier or a facilitator? And then, so following through that exercise, so as you can see, we started with nearly 14,000 studies, but in the end, only 160 that met the criteria. So there are quite more studies that cover the topic and look potentially interesting, but did not meet all those elements we specified. So these 160 studies are what we have now in this evidence map on the factors that can drive transition to modern cooking energy. So I will just click so that and just provide briefly show how the map works. So this is the systematic review map. And so this now are all the studies that the 160 criteria and were included in the review. And as you can see, the map has several filters. So you can choose studies by country in which they were done, by type of program they were focusing on, and several other criteria. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to look at, let's say, program focus. So remember the question I said we were focusing on studies of relevance. So looking at barriers and facilitators of relevance to clean cooking. So there could be a study on electricity, but looking at some of the transition factors that could be applicable to cooking as well. So this is where you can then filter out and say you only want to look at studies that focused on cookstoves. And then you find this range of studies and in this various settings where they were conducted as well. So like this shows 114 data points, which I think if you click should give you the metadata.
Yeah, Caroline, I think it's now in the still PPT form, but I think since we have link here, audience can click to the actual map to play around. So let's move on I see already there are some questions and discussions. Let's open up to our panelists to bring their insights and their experience. And many of them are actually the partners as we going through this the state of MECS study. And I want to first introduce Danny Alexander, Senior Director of Evidence and Impact from Clean Cooking Alliance. So Danny, be good to also reflect the experience, the data collected, how you see it may be useful and how we can further work together to improve the data.
Yeah, thanks, Yabe. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, this was also thank you for the really good panelists today. I think you really explained the report very well. What I see as this report has really done since the last State of the Sector report is provide a lot more detail and a lot more granular data that helps us to make decisions. And I think that that's really important. The big overarching thing that came out of this was the costs, right? The driven by the negative externalities. And that's just huge to think about, $2.4 trillion per year. But when you break that up into the health impacts, into the gender being at 0.8, I think that's really important to look at and will help us to use as a lever as we push, for funding and those types of things. Another thing, and I will try to be really short because I know we're behind here. Another thing that came out was really talking about the people that are, really considered in this transition. Out of the 4 billion people, 1.2 are considered to be in transition, and how we can focus on those. So as we look to that, I think that will be important for us. And lastly, I think one of the key things that stuck out in this report is finally the discussion on how there are multiple stoves and fuel technologies in homes. And so we need to focus on the stack and thinking about the clean stack in certain situations and how we both address that with our behavior change communications, but also our policies. And I think that was something that really came out in this report that had not been discussed before. And finally, even further, you went to show that the stacking is different in different areas. So for example, in Nepal, you're not seeing a lot of stacking, but in other places you are. And so we need to take this data and use it to work with policymakers, but also to design solutions and those types of things. So I think really a rich information, a set of data that came out of this that we see as being very useful to our programming. So I was just really pleased with a lot of the stuff that came out of here. On all parts of every chapter that had enabling environment on the supply side. I don't want to get into all of those because there's so many others, but just some really interesting data. So thank you for pushing this forward, Yabe.
Thank you very much, Danny, and your review inputs, and also using Alliance networks to collect more data. It's very helpful, and in particular for this database on players and initiatives. Also reaching out to to many of stakeholders. I think many of you may be interviewed through surveys or phone interview, providing our input.
Yeah, very happy to collaborate on this.
Yeah, thank you. So now next, I want to invite Olivia Caudry, the lead for energy finance and clean cooking for sustainable energy for all. So Olivia, I know that CFO is also doing a lot of data and including have planning tool and also the data platform. Be good to also learning from your insights perspective.
Thanks very much, Yabe, and hello, everyone. Great to be on the call. And I'd really like to commend at the outset the ESMAP team, the whole ESMAP team, CCA and the MECS team for all the fantastic work that's gone into this report. I know it was a huge effort. And as you mentioned, it really does get us to the next level of granularity and detail to help us make better decisions. So really commend the big effort. I'll just make 4 observations about the report and by reference to our own work at SE for All that I hope are helpful for the participants on the call. The first is that, as has been mentioned a few times today already, poor program design initially. So we're about to kick off with the CCF investments, which is great news for the sector. We produce a series of reports at SE for All called Energising Finance, and we've just released our 2020 editions a few weeks ago. Happy to have ESMAP, CCA and MECS on the steering committee for that work. That told us that of all the committed public finance that's going into the energy sector, a lot of it's delayed. So more than 58% of financing commitments and announcements are delayed in their disbursement, and almost half of all projects are delayed. And one of the key reasons for that is poor program design. So I really endorse all the good feasibility work that's been done in advance of CCF investment, and a call to other program designers, I guess, and donors to really put effort into that upfront program design, listen to end users to ensure that money is actually dispersed on the ground. So it's an important learning for us, and also to speak with end users in that program design at the outset to make sure that they're heard and to make sure that the solutions that are ultimately deployed will meet their needs. Second point to highlight is the policy landscape. So I won't go into detail on that as the report has done, but really there is a chronic sort of uncoordinated policy landscape for clean cooking in a lot of countries, which needs to be addressed. We're working on that at SE4 through our integrated energy planning work. And again, we need to sort of work harder as a sector to make sure that governments appreciate the co-benefits of clean cooking across all the departments and ministries that it affects in the country, given that it's just such a cross-cutting issue. Third point is around finance. So the report goes into some detail, and it's great to have those projections and finance needs going forward. And, we can see that the numbers are huge, $150 billion a year projected to 2030 to get to Tier 4 and above access. So we've got sort of orders of magnitude gaps to fill here. Our own research at SE for All tells us that it's sort of tens of millions of dollars flowing to countries with the largest clean cooking access deficit. So we have a huge road ahead of us there on filling the finance gap. I do want to highlight the role of public finance as catalytic capital. So at the moment, we're not seeing a lot of diversity in capital as it's dispersed. We're seeing public funding in the form of grants going to the sector, not a lot of diversity beyond that, and not enough private sector finance. I really like to call out the role of public finance, particularly development finance, as being catalytic to the sector and helping to crowd in private finance through risk mitigation. Affordability has also been mentioned. Thank you, Yabe, for underscoring that earlier. We do see a key role and a continuing role for public finance to fill affordability gaps. So there will be a segment of the population that, no matter how good the solution is going to struggle with affordability. So there is a role for public finance there. Last but not least, the data point. Thank you again, Yabe, for mentioning. We take data very seriously at SE4 as well. My colleagues working on integrated energy planning, very focused on that issue, and convened a data standards workshop a few months ago. As Yabe mentioned, we're also about to kick off really a sector-led initiative on clean cooking data to offer data as a public good to the sector. We'll be piloting an activity in Rwanda in good collaboration with the bank, which we're very excited about. But we do see a role for good sectoral data to be made more broadly available and more easily available to decision makers. I'll leave it at there because I know there are other panelists who I'm very keen to hear from. I hope that's been helpful.
Thank you, Olivia. We look forward to continue collaborating with you on the data side in particular. Now I would like to invite Paul Musi, the Deputy Director of Renewable Energy from Ministry of Energy, Kenya. So Paul, you are the policymakers, and I know that Kenya just recently launched the bare energy strategy. How do you see the data as playing for decision making? How you see any further data gaps? Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Yabe, and let me also commend the SMAP team and partners for this excellent work. Indeed, we recently launched a bioenergy strategy, and this strategy, from what I'm now seeing, there are still gaps that I can identify, given the sort of insights that have been provided by this study. But I think it will help us also in properly targeting the issues of where to tackle the challenge on clean cooking. I noticed that the data that has been shared provides at country level can be applied to provide a spatial extent of the access gap. That means if you now try to dive in, you are able to see which sites within the country will require what levels of effort and what kind of approaches will be required, because it is now going closer to the users in the sense that you can now appropriately target. I also got very intrigued by the systematic review as was being presented by Caroline, and I think this is a very user-friendly kind of approach where somebody can get an overview of the different factors which you can use the filters to be able to see how different factors are influencing what is being seen on the ground. Now, I also find that there are very specific insights that have been provided, and using this study, we have been able to see that the challenge is bigger than we previously thought it was. Just looking at the issue of access to clean cooking and access to improved cooking. Now, you can see that helps decision makers, and at policy level, it makes us be able to justify why certain actions need to be embraced, because using these definitional differences, you're able to say what level of effort would be required. And that also helps determine the budgetary provisions and allocations that can be provided for the cooking sector. So I think for me, this is very useful. It helps us as we progress. And like as Kenya, we just launched the bioenergy strategy. And this strategy is merely a framework of roadmap of what needs to be done. But we are going to be now breaking it down into specific interventions. And as we do that, I think we will benefit greatly from the insights that this study has provided. And thanks to everybody for what they've been doing. I think we are learning quite fast, and we are happy to apply some of these. I notice now from this that there are also data gaps that one can be able to see, which we think is important to be looked at in the coming future. One of the things that I notice is many of the countries, including Kenya, rely on the demographic and health surveys to provide that primary data that is required. In many instances, the data collection frameworks are not properly structured to collect certain levels of data. And that means at policy level, there is need now to intervene, to influence what this framework for data collection would be, so that it actually becomes more amenable to provide more accurate data, and going down to aspects including the consumer perspectives. And so from that point of view, I am seeing there are data gaps that we still be able to speak to. One is we need to know the durability of the various cooking solutions we are talking of, so that it informs the frequency of replacements. Because one of the experiences we have had in Kenya is people will buy stoves, and then when the stove breaks down, they revert to the traditional three-stone fire, just because they didn't have a strategy of when they are likely to be replacing, so it may break at a time when they are not financially able to do a replacement. So this is another area where we need to also begin to interrogate the quality and durability of the various alternative solutions that we are promoting. And then the other aspect is the user experience. Because in our case, you find the stacking is being driven by various user experiences and expectations. There are those that would have a certain fuel to cook a certain meal. There are those who will want to use one because they don't have a lot of time. They do a quick meal that will take the least of time and fuel. And these are now important insights which we need to dive into them, so that we can be able to bring out what needs to be targeted. And finally, I am thinking that as we look at the entire landscape of the policy, really policy in the future is going to be driven by accurate data. And so data must be the thing that everybody thinks about. How do we move down at national level and even subnational level to ensure that there is a continuous data collection in an accurate format which will enable decision making? Because many of the decisions are based on very sweeping statements which do not necessarily reflect the real situation on the ground. And I think this is now the way to go. And if we are going to bridge the access gap, then we must now begin to look at the deeper issues that require to be addressed, and so that we also target financing to the real issues that would make an impact. Let me hold it there, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. I think that I mean, your reflections very useful, and it's I think our thinking aligned in terms of we hope to how to collect more data and share knowledge so can better inform the policy and financing decisions. We are a bit running late for the session, like minutes away, but it's very good to see already a lot of discussion happening. So I want to invite Ed and Simon to briefly reflect your perspectives, your key partners of this MECS report and overall MECS program. And meanwhile, I want Jing Yi to start to pull out the poll. So, but Ed, you can start.
Okay, I know Simon also wants to say something, so I'll keep my comments very brief. Just to pick up, I think, on some of the discussion that there has been in the chat boxes, a lot of the points that I might have wanted to make have already been made. But just to take, I think, 4 very quick points. Firstly, there was a discussion in the chat around why are we not talking about tier 1 and tier 2 access like we do in the case of electricity, and I was happy to see some kind of pushback on that, in that I think it's a very different phenomenon. If you're talking about tiers of electricity access that then give rise to particular access to services, is a very different thing to tiers of stove access and the benefits that stove access gives. And then also you then enter into the whole question of stacking. So I don't think I'll take that any further, but I think you cannot make that kind of one-to-one argument that was being suggested there about lower stage access in relation to electricity and in relation to stove to cooking. Secondly, there was quite a lot of discussion in the chat around how much of a shift in terms of emissions was a shift towards LPG. And I just wanted to draw people's attention to the discussions that there were in the chat, but also specifically to the recent work that we've supported with the Global LPG Partnership around the potential of bio-LPG. That is the production of LPG or equivalent LPG that works as LPG from renewable sources. The third point is I think Olivia started talking about this a little bit and has mentioned it again in the chat, that it's really important to think about how the data is actually operationalized. So in other words, how can the data that we've gathered through this kind of exercise, and that is being gathered on a regular basis by ESMAP through the MTF, how do we make sure that that data is utilized as effectively as it might be? And also, how do we build different sets of data that can relate to each other more effectively? And that's something I know that ESMAP and MECS and SE for All have been hosting a series of discussions around, and will be taking further in the new year, I think in a really exciting way, particularly in some specific countries. I know Rwanda has been mentioned in that regard, but also, Paul, you'll be very pleased to hear, I'm sure, that Kenya will also feature strongly, I think, in that collaboration. Finally, I guess it's really to re-emphasize the point Olivia raised over affordability. And I think that quite often in the discussion over clean cooking, and also to a degree over off-grid electrification, it's almost as if subsidy is a dirty word. And I think actually, though, in reality, what we are talking about a lot in the sector is a different form of subsidization. And by connecting into the debates about electricity, I think there are different ways of thinking about supporting access of the very poorest sectors. So I think that would be interesting to explore and to discuss in further detail. But Simon, I think you're probably going to pick up on that particularly.
Thank you. Yes, just a few comments. In fact, I'd like to hook all the way back to Rohit's introduction. You know, that cooking has been a poor cousin of modern energy access generally, and that we focus a lot on electricity and the rollout of electricity. But I think that as we integrate them more, and this picks up on Olivia's integrated energy strategies, we should be able to move forward on that. And particularly in the MTF, they have modules on tier access to electricity, which nuances and gives the quality of the electricity supply, and then the nuances and the fabulous data that we're getting on the clean cooking side. And Yabe has heard this before, but I'm going to make it a public plea for slightly more integration between the electricity access modules of MTF and the clean cooking side of things. But then I want to pick up on the Dalberg numbers. You know, of that 150 billion, 100 billion-ish is the fuel costs for the household. And so that is a question of revenue. And for somebody, if it pivots to modern energy, and in fact, even since the report was written, we have the whole COVID crisis, and we have a lot of utilities sitting there saying demand for electricity has dropped, and we are now over generating, but we don't have a mechanism for getting the revenue back in. And I see that Besnik is on the call, and if any of you want to talk that through, Besnik is one of the champions that's really sort of able to make this connection between cooking and electricity. And my last point is that Caroline, in her systematic review, one of the things that came out of that was that she and her team found a lack of urban studies, which is really surprising. And we know that the world is increasingly urbanizing, and even Africa is moving more and more towards urban environments. And of course, urban environments are, if you like, a sort of easier environment to move towards infrastructure and supply chains. And interestingly, the bio-LPG that Ed picked up on talks about converting municipal waste into biogas and then pivoting it to propane. So there's lots of interconnections here, and I'm glad to hear Paul talk about bringing things together and sort of in a policy environment, try to do interministerial connections and cross-chatting. Thank you, Yabe.
Thank you, Ed, Simon. We have a few more minutes, so if anyone wants to come in, please raise your hand, either to respond to some of the questions already raised through the chat box, or raise another question.
Hi, this is Michael Stone from Delberg. Well, maybe just a quick question, forward-looking question. We don't really have time to pick up on some of the great questions that we're seeing. But from a forward-looking perspective, I think what was clear to us in reflecting on is that the model was built with a very much a macro view in mind to make this model truly useful. And I think a lot of this is already happening through the work that SMAP is doing. But to make the model really useful, it does require translating some of this to a much more national level, right? So if one was to productize some of this as a strategy planning tool or a decision-making tool for governments, policymakers, and other stakeholders in making specific trade-offs on investment decisions or policy decisions, it does require, there's a lot that we can build off of from MTF and other sources, but it does require taking more of a national view because there's a lot of variation that our model was glossing over as it was averaging across very different contexts. And so we would love to, I know there's not time in this session, but we'd love to continue the conversation of how to build in the model, how to translate it into useful country level strategy tools.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add in some comments? A response? Okay, maybe I can come in to summarize basically. So I think there are consensus that the data is important for our decision making, for our financing investment, for all the players basically in the sector. So it's really our interest to provide these public goods to all stakeholders. And I think again that this report has the opportunity to collect a lot of data, and through some modeling approach to build some country level data. I mean, I'm not saying the data will be perfect because it's a learning process, but at least I think the framework for this endeavor already set up. So our next steps is to hope to work with all the partners, interest partners. Please, we will reach out to some partners, but also open to interest partners to reach to us. We're interested in terms of consolidate the data at the country level. So as I mentioned that we have at the country level the state of modern energy, the state of access to MECS, the by tiers, and the cost of inaction. The database of, who are doing what in terms of players, initiatives, and literature review of what research are already being done in each country or by each topic. And then the investment needs needed for transitioning from current state to universal access, either to improve cooking scenario or the MECS scenario. And then we can also add on the RISE indicator, as Rohit mentioned today, that the RISE report is launched with a full module on access to clean cooking. By having that consolidated data at the country level, I think it's provide the first good overview of the sector. And then at the country level, want to develop more of D2 action plan, it's into more granular data at the region, a state, or the local level. But again, that clean cooking is very contextual. In order to understand that it's contextual information, we need to collect data. And with more, I think, efforts by partners, we can deepen in more of such information, collect information and understanding the information, and then can help all of us to make better decisions. With that, want to thank you everyone who contributing to the session, especially our speakers and the panelists, and everyone with your questions. And we will, as normal common practice from SMAP, we will share the presentations and the session video recording after the session ends. Okay, wish everyone very good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.